Hi everyone, my name is Anna Clements and I'm the founder and chief exec of Autism and ADHD. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Jonathan to you. Some of you may remember Jonathan if you were part of our free weekly trainings that we done last year for teachers, as he came on and spoke about his experience with school. But Jonathan and I are now going to be doing a regular little chat. All right, so talking about how things are going, learning more about each other maybe as well, and hopefully that will be something interesting for you guys to listen to or watch and learn from, because that's the whole point. So I'm going to hand you over to Jonathan. Jonathan can introduce himself and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Annie. And I'm not always great with introductions, but hi everyone, I'm Jonathan. And I'm trying to think of an interesting fact. It's like when you do icebreakers and meetings and that kind of thing. And I like fountain pens. I have worked closely with Annie for a little while now, and I'm really excited to join everyone to just have a bit of a conversation about how autism and ADHD affects my life.
And can I just say, Jonathan's pen collection is pretty amazing, and I'm very jealous. being a fellow stationery fan, they are really, really lovely, Jonathan's fountain pens. So couldn't have them here because the dog would be my biggest concern, that he would get hold of them and eat them. He's got a dreadful habit of eating pens. He doesn't eat slippers, he just eats pens. And he destroyed a red pen of mine just recently, one of the gel pens.
I know.
And it was all over the carpet. If we'd have drawn a body shape around it, it would have looked like a murder scene on the carpet like you see on the TV. So as much as I'd love one of your pens, I do worry about it a little bit.
Yeah, no, I tend to be like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings when it comes to my pens. It's like, don't let anyone touch it. Always, whenever I'm in at work, I always have a spare pen to give away, because sometimes you can't say no to people who want a pen in the moment. They tend to grab before they ask. So having an emergency pen on standby is always quite useful to have, particularly when you're in a hot desking environment.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I tend to go home with a completely different set of pens that I arrived with if I've gone into a meeting. So I tend to pick up everybody else's and then lose mine. So somebody must benefit from my lost pen collection somewhere.
Sounds like you're a scavenger more than anything else.
Probably just pick things up. But it's a bit of this, I think it's that whole stationery thing coming into play. So Jonathan, would you say that pens have always been a special interest for you, or is that something that's arrived for you as an adult?
I think it's interesting because the first thing that I mentioned about something interesting about me is pens and stationery, but I wouldn't say that I like stationery and pens just within themselves. Um, but for me, they're very much tools. I am a serial doodler, and I always think that my mind runs a bit too fast. And even with writing things down, I only capture a fraction of what's actually going through my mind. But that being said, I think I find an immense amount of satisfaction from being able to articulate my thoughts through pen and paper. So I remember when I first went into university, that's when I first got my first fountain pen. I think because I was doing a law degree at the time, I always thought lawyers, good pens. And I remember in the first year being like, one day I'll get like a really fancy pen. I was googling what are the best types of pens that lawyers have, and it all came up with like Mont Blanc and those really expensive pens. And I was like, I'm never going to be able to afford that. Lo and behold, a couple years after doing a bit of exchanges and trades and that kind of thing, I now own maybe 5 or 6 Mont Blancs.
No, yes.
Um, but for me, yeah, it's very much pens in general, and the tools to write down my thoughts have always been part of my life, but it's evolved over time. So when I was in secondary school and primary school, we only got pencils. I remembered you have to have good handwriting in order to like qualify to get a good pen. Um, and my handwriting has always been atrocious, and I
Oh, I
think
would
I've always had
disagree
really
with that.
bad. Well, it's gone better now, but that's only through practice. I always had bad handwriting because I had a bad posture, and I constantly had cramps when I was writing. So that's why I transitioned to fountain pens. I think because they force you to write a bit slower, I
Yes,
can now be a bit more legible. So I always feel a bit of imposter syndrome when anyone says, "Oh, Jonathan, you have lovely handwriting." It's like you would not have said that 5 years ago.
interesting.
But the,
I have to say, having sat across a table with you, like we did in London the other week, and watch you, how you make your notes when we're talking, and he's got an incredible system, folks, with little post-it notes and stickers and things about how he records the things in his book. And I was just absolutely fascinated to watch Jonathan record things in that way. I have to say, I'm much better too. I found that I remember things better if I've written them down myself, not type them into a computer, or but I need to physically write them. Like I can
they disappear
write,
into never.
yeah, I can write a shopping list out, and then if I forget it, because I wrote that out, I will remember it when I'm at the shop. But if someone had just said, "Oh, on the way home, can you get tea bags?" that would have gone out of my head like there's no tomorrow. I think it's really important to bring those sorts of things up with the way that we chat with each other. In that these strategies are all useful for you guys that are listening to try, if nothing else, and work out which works best for you. So for me, the physically writing things down really does help. I've got so many notebooks sat behind me just full of me remembering this or putting that down, or if something pops in my head that I think, oh, that would be a really good thing for a Facebook post, I immediately have to write it down on a piece of paper. Otherwise, within 30 seconds, it's gone out of my head. So it is worth just thinking through why we do the things that we do and how can we share those things to help other people learn from that. So
I think that's an important point that you bring up, though, about uh, getting comfortable with what works for you. And the reason why I interject is I had a conversation recently with a colleague who asked me why I write everything down when it's objectively much slower than typing things on the computer. And my argument was writing things down is much more deliberate than typing it in. You can't necessarily delete something as easily when you're writing it down. I think, particularly if you struggle with filtering through important bits of information, I think your brain will force you to write just the important points. If you are having to handwrite an entire document, you're not going to then go around talking about stuff that's not necessarily relevant because it's going to take you a long time. And I think our brains tend to want to go straight onto the most important thing. So I think that's a really good way of filtering information. And I was recently writing a letter to my pen pal. I say recently, as in this morning, and I attached that my system has evolved to now have this tiny little key which I printed out and hand wrote. So when I'm actually doing it, I have symbols to show what I'm talking about. So like an exclamation mark is a task, and a question mark is like a query for me to check in future. I think that's a really important point that you make, that it, be be comfortable exploring what works for you. It might not necessarily be fountain pens. You might really like just having a pencil to sketch whilst you're in a meeting, or if you get anxious in loud places, it can be useful, like I do, to have a tiny reporter pad where you can just mind dump what your thoughts are, what's stressing you out. I think there's a really interesting technique that I heard that my partner uses, which is like the five senses, where when they're stressed, they write down what they're hearing and what they're feeling and what they're seeing. And having a notebook and putting pen to paper what your thoughts are can be a really useful way of getting around that. I had a question though for you. It's like, are you the type of person that has one notebook for everything, or are you one a notebook for each topic?
oh no, I have a notebook for everything. If I'm in a really, I can get off on tangent, and then as well as having a notebook for everything, I have notebooks for different things. So I have to be
Same, I
really
can't make up my mind.
so I certainly have folders that are individualized where I, store information and things. But I I find having one central thing is better for me from an ADHD perspective, because if not, I can
Mm,
end up with 6 books and I can't see the whole thing. So my brain needs to see a whole problem to be able to make sense of what my
yeah.
part in that problem is and how I then solve that. And if I have too many books, I lose that concept of what's going on. Whereas having everything in one central place, over the years, I've just found that much better. And I think what you were saying earlier about don't feel worried about working through different ways of doing something to find out what it is that actually works for you. I think from an ADHD perspective, be interested to hear from yours from an autism perspective, but we can then get bored with a system, even though we know it's working. And so I can have 2 or 3 systems, but the end result of that is all the same. So it's very important for me when we do support meetings that we have notes that we can then store in our SharePoint drive. All right. And I will go through stages where I will make notes on our proper printed out sheets. Other days I'll be using, and then I'll get bored with that. It'll be like, oh, I can't be able to do that anymore. And I start to slip behind. And that can obviously be problematic from what it is that we're trying to achieve. I've also got my remarkable iPad piece of tech bit where I can make notes and it immediately stores it again into the SharePoint. Other times I'll be using just a plain lined piece of paper like you put in a folder. I can move, and so I can move between those 3 systems, but the end result of each of those systems is exactly the same in that the notes end up in a secure drive. So it keeps me on task, keeps me up with the job that I need to do that allows us to work in a professional way. And so the end result is the same, which is the bit that's important for me about how I keep my brain interested in being organized, because it's a skill that I have to work at every single day. It's not something that comes naturally. I'm never going to be a naturally organized person. I need a system, and writing things down is a critical part of that system. But providing the end result is the same, I can use different ways to achieve that to keep my brain interested and keep the dopamine kicking in. So
I
from
find
an
it
autism
interesting that you say
perspective,
that
yeah,
you do.
how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I am slightly envious of your ability to change system and that still be okay. I think that's the one sinister caveat that I would say makes it difficult for me day by day. I spend a ridiculous proportion of my day deciding on my method to get through the day. I think that's what I can find rather paralyzing. And I think people maybe don't give enough credit to how much that can take out of your day, where there's a bit of decision paralysis. I think, in particular, I remember when I was writing essays at university, I wouldn't get started until I had decided on the exact right piece of paper and the right exact pen and ink. I think it's interesting that it almost seems like that was the conduit by which I was procrastinating from. And I think sometimes a tool like Remarkable, where you kind of have the options built into the system, but there's no real distractions, where there's a limit of the choices that you can make. It's just a device where you can write notes, can actually be quite useful. I think that's something that people should also consider when they're thinking about the method that works for them. It's like you can overcomplicate your system. I think the parallel that I always make is that my autism makes it that my brain needs a system in order to get things done, and my ADHD decides to tell me to go away and decides that that system's no good and I'm bored. And I think that's the frustration of dealing with them in tandem is you have to find a good balance. So I haven't found that balance yet. I think I still find days where I'm like, I'm going all of my tasks into this digital to-do list and it's fantastic. And then the next week I realize that there's not this particular feature and I can do this on my like pen and paper, but it's taking me 3 hours to get a task done where it should take me 10 minutes. So I think
for me,
Hmm.
then get into this whole prison where we start to ableize ourselves, thinking that,
Yeah.
well, my system is obviously wrong, because that's not how everybody else in the office does it, or how, I was taught to do it when I was in school. So the fact that I'm getting in a muddle with my system must mean that I'm doing it wrong, and I need to go back to a neurotypical system, when actually that's not what I need at all. I now have accepted, in a very positive way, that I need to have this flexibility within my systems, for me to be able to do the jobs that I do, and without me getting stressed and overwrought about it. I think we're never completely there, if I'm honest.
Mm.
I think it's always a work in progress, mainly because our lives constantly change. There's a baseline that's, struck along, but every day is different. Every day will bring you different things that come through into your world that you couldn't have anticipated, or just throws your system out. And so I think the big thing is reaching that mindset of being able to embrace that this is how it is, this is me, I need that for me, my ADHD, to feel as settled as I can make it. And it doesn't mean I'm getting it wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm procrastinating or lazy or not interested in what I do. It means that I need to do the things I do in a different way. Maybe every 2 or 3 weeks, I'll gradually feel that so-called disengagement, boredom, whatever word you want to say, kick in, and I know, okay, I need to get my miracle out now and put this bit away. That bit will come back in another month. All right, it's not like it's lost, but this is where I need to now just keep switching it over and not seeing that as failing. That is what this is, and being able to embrace that. And I think that makes a really, really big difference. Because of your age, you're not as far into that journey as I am. And so you will constantly keep learning that and discovering, I think, rather than learning, what works and what you don't need to fall into that trap of trying to fit in with everybody else. And that for me is
Well, I
what
think
this
it's a
is
fantastic
about.
point, though. Like, I hadn't even considered that perhaps I might be self-limiting myself and kind of being much more difficult to myself and much more critical than I otherwise should be. I think that's why it's so interesting to bounce our perspectives off each other, because I hadn't even considered that that could be a option. I think in my head, my default is if a system is not working, it's because I'm inherently failing on my side not to fit in. But I think this is a good point to consider, that sometimes acknowledgement that society in general and the ways that kind of work has been designed for neurotypicals and just day-to-day life is not necessarily the way that things ought to be. And I think that is a good point, because I hadn't considered for a moment that I might be being overly critical. So I think that's a really important point for me to take away and think about.
So we had no plan for this evening, folks. All right, we
No,
had
we're just
no plan to
rambling.
sit. You'll get used to this. All right, Jonathan and I can talk for hours about all sorts of things, and it's a bit like any of you that have watched Binley Colony on stage. We sort of end up at the beginning gradually and come around in a big circle.
We shouldn't have
Um,
started with pens.
I don't know. I think it was a good thing. Look where we ended up with that. It ended up with, considering how we ableize ourselves constantly trying to fit in, because that's what we were taught to do. We were taught that what we were taught us was wrong, and that's not actually very helpful. So I hope you found tonight interesting. I've really enjoyed talking to Jonathan about friends and organization and pens and all those sorts of things. And I hope that this is an introduction for you guys about the types of things that we're going to end up talking about, which can be completely random.
Well,
But
thanks for having me. It's like nice to have the opportunity to bounce it off you.
I know, and likewise, and that we can add something along your journey about getting you to go away and think about what this is, because to coin a phrase that we've used a lot, or I've used a lot over the years, and it came out of nowhere on a particular session. We were myself and Tom, who was a fellow director of mine at the time. We'd gone to a sort of a networky thing, and there was a guy there that was taking pictures of people in Ipswich, but we had to hold up a whiteboard with a saying of something that meant something to us, and he made them into this massive big mural. It was amazing, the finished result. But I was standing in this queue with my pen and my board and thinking, what am I going to write? I haven't a clue. And all of a sudden this thing popped into my head, which was, it's normal to be different because everybody is different. So my phrase was, it's normal to be different. And I think that's what this is. Maybe that's what we need to call our blog, actually, Jonathan, that it's normal to be different.
I like it.
Yeah, so I've still got the original picture somewhere. I'll have to get it out and send it to you. I look a lot younger than I do now. But I think it being able to put that forward, that the things that we do and the way that we do them actually in many ways are normal. It's just we wrap it up with this word difference, and that's not very helpful for anybody. So yes, thanks very much for listening, guys. I don't know if Jonathan's got anything he wants to say to round off the session.
I think just saying it's normal to be different is a good closing line.
Great.
And thank you very much for having me.
And we'll be here again soon. Take care.
Bye.